Welcome everyone to our webinar this morning, or for others it may be afternoon, as I believe we have attendees joining us from around the world. So a big thank you for joining us. For a quick introduction, my name is Jane Renane. I am the co-founder and CEO of Tallyvest. The webinar today is one that I'm particularly excited about. I believe the topic needs no introduction or emphasis on the importance of organisations needing to invest in their learning and development, particularly given the times that we're in. And we've brought together a really interesting and diverse panel of different experts coming from different industries who I know will talk through their own experiences, and this will lead to a really interesting conversation that hopefully everybody will gain some insights into for themselves when they're thinking about their strategy for 2020 and 2021. We have Fiona Buckley today moderating our event, and Fiona is an amazing woman. She does everything from being a work behaviour scientist to a corporate trainer, and when she's got time working in the Irish Management Institution. So I know Fiona will have a lot to add to the conversation. So Fiona, I'll hand it over to you, and I hope that everybody takes a lot away from our conversation today. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Jane. That's a fantastic introduction. I better not disappoint. Fantastic woman, as you said. So I'm really excited to have this webinar today. Really looking forward to the conversation. L&D has been really in the spotlight since the pandemic hit. So really what we're going to be looking at today is all around why L&D needs to play a critical role in the organisation, why perhaps old traditional more methods are becoming a little bit more redundant, and what we need to do going forward. And most importantly, why organisations need to continually invest in L&D, and then that transition of how we're bringing things from that traditional approach online. So I'm delighted to say we have a very good panel here today, and I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves very quickly, and then we're going to get straight in. So Sarah, I'll start with you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah McGowan. I'm the head of enterprise learning solutions for an e-commerce company called eShopWorld. So we provide e-commerce solutions for some of the world's top brands. For example, Nike would be one of our big ones.
Lovely, thank you, Sarah. Wendy?
Hi, I'm Wendy Smith, and I'm a Global Director of Talent Enablement at Segura.
Great, thank you, Wendy. Andrew?
Hello everyone, Andrew, one of the co-founders and the CEO at a company called GoOne. You can think of us as sort of like a Spotify for education. We don't create content, but just make it easy to access it.
Very good way of explaining it. Ger.
Hi everyone, I'm Ger Healy, and I am just after making the jump out of industry into academics, and I'm currently a teacher/lecturer in the University of Limerick.
Very good. And Luke.
Morning everyone, I'm Luke from Tallyvest, previously heading up sales intelligence for EMEA at LinkedIn, and now heading up analytics for Tallyvest.
Wonderful. Thank you. Really looking forward to this. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to start with you. It sounds like you're in a very busy role inside an eShopWorld. So I've one big question that we're going to start with. We are experiencing so many impacts from COVID-19. In particular, there's some very big challenges when it comes to L&D leaders looking at how we can bring everything from in-person to online. In your opinion, how do you think L&D leaders can continue to prepare for this? Or indeed, what do you think has worked really well or not so well from what you've seen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When the pandemic hit earlier on this year, I had a lot of ex-colleagues reach out to me because my background is online delivery. And it's been that way for a number of years. And there was a big push a few years ago to move on to kind of online digital learning, but not so much around virtual learning. And that was kind of the biggest challenge that came up for L&D leaders at the beginning of this pandemic, because there was no time to prepare. It was essentially shift rapidly or fail. And that put a significant amount of pressure on L&D leaders, and in particular on trainers who would have traditionally and most comfortably been in a physical classroom. And one of the biggest challenges that people were coming to me with was, but I just don't know how to do it. I just don't know how to even get my head around making that shift as a trainer. I mean, all of my training plans are all based on Classroom. All of my training needs analysis was based on Classroom. I don't even know where to start. It felt like there was an elephant that needed to be ate, and you just have no idea how to even start doing it. And that challenge hasn't really gone away. And my thinking around why that hasn't gone away is that we inherently stick with what we're most comfortable with. And trainers are most comfortable being physically in front of their students. They get a read off them. They can see the body language. They can tell when they're losing people. They can tell when they need to make a shift in their approach. And that is far more difficult virtually. So a lot of L&D leaders and trainers were avoiding it. They were really avoiding it because they thought, look, this is not going to be here forever. We don't need to make that shift. It's a temporary blip in everything. We don't really need to change our plans. Unfortunately, the reality is you do. And that's it. Because it's not only about you, it's actually about your learners. It's about your students. And I think a lot of us have lost sight of that because of the panic of that shift. We started thinking about what was most comfortable for us. We didn't really think about what our learners need. And that mentality shift, if it hasn't happened already for people, that's what you need to actually start thinking about. Ignore the software, ignore the virtual training, ignore all of that elephant that's freaking everyone out. Think about what your learners actually need and actually talk to them. Talk to your business leaders, talk to your stakeholders, talk to your learners. What actually is going to make them most comfortable? One of the biggest pieces of information that we got within our company very early on was, are you as a learner actually comfortable with this? What is the best approach we can give you in order for us to successfully continue your own development? Because they are also panicking right now. They're dealing with their own work, but one of the biggest challenges for them is, am I going to be able to continuously improve in my role? Am I going to miss out on promotions because I'm not going to have the same opportunities that I would have had? These are the things that are going through their head, and you need to support them and make sure that you're providing that support with them. So take a breath. Look at what your learners need, look at what your stakeholders need, and that will drive your approach with how to make this shift if it hasn't already happened.
Some really good advice there already, because as a trainer, I can see we are in our own heads a lot, but we have to jump into their mindset from their perspective as well. And as you said, great tips. Ignore the technology, just be there, because you doing what you do is still the same, whether it's virtual or not. I'm going to stick with you, Sarah, with another question. So L&D departments, as you well know, and you've worn the t-shirt here, have had an awful lot of pressure in terms of themselves. So there's a lot of L&D people working in L&D coming on this call today. So what skills or lessons do you think L&D leaders need to learn to adapt to this new method? And you can bring us back to yourself as an example if you wish, but what do you think you have really needed here to help yourself as an L&D leader?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really front of mind for me at the moment, because I've done a few talks like this, and one of the common traits that I like to talk about is how you are perceived. What is your reputation where you are, whether you're in-house as I am, or whether you are in a consultancy, or whether you are working as a standalone, your own company, and you are working with different clients. It doesn't really matter. What is your reputation? Are you coming in as somebody that they trust and that they see as a partner, or are you coming in as somebody who is spouting the religion of L&D practice? Because that's not what they need right now. What they need is a partner, and that partnership and those relationships are really important. The more that you can understand the needs of your stakeholders, it's not about Addy, it's not about Kirkpatrick, it's not about all of the theory behind what makes training great. It's about how you are perceived and what your reputation is, and building up that reputation right now, because they need you. You are a key support now for these stakeholders. L&D would have always traditionally been seen as kind of a cost to a company. It was kind of a nice to have. And we all know back in the recession previously, it was probably the first thing to get cut when there was budgets being cut. That is totally different now. We are seen as actually a key stakeholder in the success of an organization, but that is based on your reputation. So having an understanding of the pain points across the business, demonstrating that you know what's happening across the organization, especially now. I mean, I'm very lucky and blessed that I'm in an organization who are thriving right now, but there are others that are not so lucky. And understanding those pain points and making sure that you are considered a key asset during this time is really important.
And another key piece of advice here for everyone on the call, because I think what we can do here is L&D can have a bit of a refresh or a rebrand with this. There's always an opportunity to do that. And now is the best time to have that rebrand, to be seen as that real true partner to the business. So thank you, Sarah. I'm going to come back to you in a little while when we have a more free flow questions, but I'm going to come to Wendy next again. Thank you, Sarah, for that. So Wendy, you have a lot of experience. I know you've written articles in Forbes and stuff, and we're really looking forward to getting to that. But you have a lot of experience in recruiting teams for as small as 10 all the way to a large as 30,000. So how do you think L&D is going to be managed with these kind of sizes of organizations with everything that's going on at the moment?
Right. So a good question. The thing is, the reality is every employee in a company needs the same thing out of learning, whether it is a company of 10 or a company of 30,000. And so it really becomes a challenge when you're working in a smaller organization, is simply the fact that you don't have the luxury and the resources that the large companies get. So I can say, of course, again, in working with those large companies, we had great resources with good technology, massive learning departments. But again, the reality is when it was a smaller company, those employees still want and need not only the functional training that is required for their roles, but they also want that additional, growth opportunities, the soft skill trainings, the things that, again, when you're a small department, you don't tend to have as much resources to make that possible. So what I found is when you work in the smaller organizations, you just have to use a lot more creativity to get done your job. So thinking about the kind of resources that are out there that are free, we leveraged, for example, a lot of the MOOCs and things that were available that were free, very creative types of learning opportunities. We, in different departments, we would implement programs where, for example, one that we did that was received very well within one team was we had them do monthly a reading assignment where they would read whatever business course they wanted as a choice, but then they had to present it to their team. And there was different requirements around the presentation had to be only 5 minutes in length. They had to use visual only presentation without bullet points. And so then the rest of the team would actually do a rubric and grade them on their presentation skills. But on top of that, they were actually learning about a business topic. And so it was, again, it was still learning, but it was a very different approach than the idea of they're going out on a learning platform and they're taking virtual learning, either that's instructor-led or digital. So again, I found on those smaller departments, you just have to be really creative in how you deploy the learning and make sure that there's a lot of communication around the fact that this is still continual learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really good advice for small companies. I know here in Ireland at the moment, there's a lot of free training being given by, the local enterprise offices and things like that. So I absolutely agree, Wendy, creativity is the way when you're in that smaller versus the larger one. So you did write an article in Forbes, and I think, Jane might publish this with the pack for participants as well. So you wrote an article all about creating the ultimate employee experience. What are your thoughts on creating this unique experience in a virtual capacity now?
Right. So as you referred to, what the article really focused on is this concept of consumer workers, where it's the idea that today the way that we approach work as consumers is very similar to how we approach our brands and products that we buy. And so we really choose our employer brands in that same fashion, and we choose it every day that we come back to that company versus where we really shop around and find other companies that are offering a value proposition that we want more. And so with respect to how we create learning experiences that inspire those consumer workers is the fact that they're looking for the very personalized experience, again, just like we are as consumers now. And I look at it as that Amazon effect, that we are very familiar now with going out on sites like Amazon that get to know us better than we know ourselves. They are able to produce recommendations of products that we want that we're like, wow, I never even knew I wanted that. But they're basing that on mass amounts of algorithms and data around, okay, people like you who have bought this buy things like this too. And so in a learning perspective, again, when you've got the technology that's getting better and better around being able to see, okay, here's the courses, again, that you tend to look at, you tend to take, here's the courses that you've given high ratings to. And so again, when people have given this course high ratings, they tend to also give these courses high ratings. So we really love as consumer workers who are, out there in the learning platforms to have that very personalized content put in front of us to say, this is what we think you are going to be interested in, instead of us coming up with these blanket decisions around, well, because you happen to be in sales or you happen to be in HR, we think here's the courses you should take. And so being able to create a very personalized environment that is also flexible and allows people to choose what they want in their journey to learning, I think is really critical.
That's really good advice. It's all about personalization at the moment, because as I said, one size fits all approach is kind of gone. I don't think that ever really stuck, but now more than ever. So thank you for that, Wendy. Andrew, I'm going to come to you next. So we're talking lots about courses. Let's get into a little bit more detail about some courses. So what do you think you need to do to motivate employees to finish courses? Let's talk about motivation, because motivation at the moment is a little bit thin for some people. So in your experience, can we motivate employees to finish courses?
Look, it'll probably come across as a little bit sort of cliched or sort of self-evident, but I think it's, as we think about how do we each as individuals on this call learn, what do we enjoy, how do we consume information? I think there can be sort of both a push and pull when it comes to learning, and so maybe we can sort of cover both of those categories. You can sort of imagine part of learning some of the topics that we've been talking about today, and I think some of the words that Wendy was using should have been writing down. It sounded like a perfect sales pitch for sort of describing, I suppose, where we see the future of learning as well, that sort of personalization, the recommendation to go, this is something that the system thinks is genuinely going to help you, and it therefore can be delightful. And I think in those situations where someone's really sort of engaging with material, maybe it's content which doesn't need to be massively long. It might be a 15-minute video or a short book summary, or it might be a blog, or it might be a podcast or something of that. Typically, we see really high completion rates in that style of content. Certainly as a platform, we see millions of users where it's sort of 90-95% plus completion rates, because the individual's going, this is something that I'm really, really interested in. You can then sort of juxtapose that with other forms of training. And again, I think learning is such a broad banner. So we've just spoken about one example, but then to take the other extreme, really important, but perhaps a little bit less easy to sort of get that excitement around might be compliance training. Super important, needs to be done, but I would not put up my hand to say I'm super excited to do my annual compliance training. And I think in those situations, it's really understanding the team members that we're working with, not patronizing, not providing sort of death by PowerPoint, not having sort of quizzes, which I suppose can be sort of insulting, going, do you do A or do you do B? And obviously there's one right answer. And it's investing in content which can be engaging, interesting, and I think therefore when you're learning something, you want to keep going, and when it's sort of just mind-numbing, then you probably don't have the desire to get to the end.
Okay, and Sarah, I think you might want to come in, so I'll come back to you in a moment when I just finish another question with Andrew, so I'll give you an opportunity to tag on to that. So Andrew, your answers might be similar in terms of this, but everyone's looking at doing courses at the moment and developing courses. What do you think makes a good customer experience? How has that changed for that end user? And maybe from feedback from other companies or other things that have gone well online, what works? What is really that secret sauce at the moment? And maybe there's not, but we're trying to see what works.
Yeah, and probably it's the best way of describing that is thinking about other mediums over time, over history. And so you can sort of imagine when cinema and theatre was first developed, the initial sort of movies that we have were just stage shows that were recorded, and we didn't take advantage of the different sort of affordances of that as a medium. The same with television, radio, and so too, I think when we think of online courses today, we think of MOOCs that still largely sort of content that has been sort of taken from a textbook or taken from a lecture or taken from sort of, I suppose, a set of slides and maybe animated, but it's still, there's a lot of opportunity to innovate. And so I think that's what we see the opportunity as being, and certainly where we see higher engagement, is when people are really thoughtful to go, how do we innovate and take advantage of the different sort of mediums? I'm not sure in the different parts of the world that attendees are coming from, but everywhere in Australia where you go out to a cafe, there'll be a QR code. You have to sort of scan that and fill in a form for contact tracing related to coronavirus. But we've seen organizations put QR codes on fire extinguishers around the office, other locations to go, easy access to learning, other things of that nature, where I think you can just go, how do we decrease the barriers, make it really easy to learn in the flow of work, make the content bite-sized, string it together, so therefore, whilst it's bite-sized, it still stacks up to something that can be a more full pathway. They're the things that I think are really sort of the hallmarks of a great user experience, is just to sort of focus on how do you create really engaging content and make it easy for the individual to access and consume.
And I think going back to Sarah's original point is getting into their head, getting into what they actually want. So Sarah, did you want to tail on to that?
Yeah, it was just as Andrew was talking about the compliance training and around the engagement, and it also follows on a little bit from what Wendy was saying about kind of smaller departments and not having a huge budget. Just to give an example around that, we are currently running a Cyber Month, which is entirely run by our compliance team, and normally it would be just doing the compliance training, which, as we all know, in L&D tends to be a bit of a tick the box exercise. But what we've actually done this month is we've gamified it. So we've actually given points and badges for each activity that they do, and we've approached it as a blended learning. So we have the standard compliance training through the LMS, but we're also doing live sessions and different compliance related games. And the feedback has been phenomenal. The cost has been minimal. I think the entire month has cost us €1,000 for the entire month, and that's for 470 employees. And the engagement has been huge. Yeah. I get feedback every day from people saying that they love it.
That's amazing. That's a real. And did you come up with that, Sarah? Was that your idea?
Yeah. Again, my thesis was on gamification and online and virtual training, so I finally had an opportunity to take advantage of it. But even from an engagement perspective, given everything is remote, it's been really helpful for people just to get back engaged with learning. Yeah,
it's great to get that thesis cobwebs dusted off and use it again.
Exactly.
So speaking of thesis, Ger, I'm sure you love that word, given you're in an academic environment. I'm going to come to you next. So let's talk again about what your opinion is on this. What do you think organizations need to be doing to focusing on improving that L&D experience at the moment?
Well, thanks, Fiona. And that is a really good question. And I suppose at this point, the themes that I would talk about have been covered by Sarah, Wendy, and Andrew. And I suppose my key points of that would be learner centricity again, which Sarah discussed in huge detail, the need to put the learner at the center of the experience. And when I was thinking about the question, I suppose there are two contexts to that. There's the context in relation to the actual learning intervention itself, whatever that might be. And then there's the context in relation to the policy. And I suppose when I think about the learning policy or the learning program and the organization there, and I suppose when I think of learning events and the planning and the effort that organizations put into learning events, I would think that organizations that are worried about experience of learners need to probably give themselves a break, because the vast majority of organizations that I come across and that I've dealt with over time put huge time, effort, energy, and resource into trying to develop that learner experience that does respond to learner needs and does respond to delivering learning in particular ways so that it makes the experience good for the particular learner. And that's exactly what needs to be done. And if I link it to the COVID world to try and shorten my answer a bit, we would still need to continue to do that even in the online world. So it isn't as simple as just transferring the learning we have out of the classroom and into the online world. We do still need to think about those particular experiences and get creative in ways which, again, Sarah has meant I don't have to give an example, because she just gave a beautiful example of compliance training in the online world, but using that creativity as well. And what I talk about in relation to experience, where I think some of the problems might arise, are in dealing with policy itself and cynicism that sometimes exists around learning and development, which is often driven sometimes by misunderstandings as to why we make people learn things in organizations. And I suppose there's two concepts which I keep in mind when it comes to experience around adult learning. There, people learn when they're comfortable, and people learn when they know the purpose as to why they're in the room. So as often as we can get people comfortable, why we want them to participate in learning, and also let them know and help them get the buy-in in advance as much as possible as to why we want them to participate in that learning. That's where I think we unlock the key and remove some of that cynicism in relation to they're making me do this learning, or they're making me participate in learning and development in those particular areas. So whatever tools we can give employees to self-identify their development areas, I think is the key to ensuring they get the overall good experience. Once we get them into the room or into the experience, we do well. It's just sometimes in advance, we don't necessarily do the groundwork to explain that and explain our reasoning for that as well. And in the COVID world, I'll summarize by saying that's still important to do, I suppose. It's still important to create that need. And of course, to use the tools of the online learning platforms and the various digital tools we have to help them self-assess their needs in this environment where maybe we don't have them beside us to talk to them about it.
Yeah, it's some really good tips there. And I think being a corporate trainer myself, I can see that you have to create that expectations in advance. People are coming online onto courses. They've no idea where they're there. Their manager put them on it. You know, there's no background or expectation setting. And it's very hard to break that, you know, that wall virtually with that person, because they're not even sure why they're there. And speaking on that, Ger, in terms of inclusivity, I think this is a really important thing to mention. But how can we make sure we're creating inclusive and diverse learning modules? Because with this one, people learn at different paces, and I'm seeing a big difference, say, with introverts and extroverts on training courses. The pacing is way off for some, and more dominant personalities are overshadowing on these virtual training sessions than more quieter, considered kind of personalities. It's different in the classroom. Any thoughts on that?
Loads of thoughts, but I don't know if I've unlocked the key to answering that question just yet. I'm dealing with 600 students on a module that we're now delivering online this year, who are doing it at all different paces, and there's huge challenges arising from that. And I suppose what I will say is, again, creativity in your approach to the module is a hugely important aspect to creating a diverse and inclusive module. And I suppose, again, considering the different needs of your learners within that are hugely important factors as well. I suppose when I'm talking about diversity in this context, I was thinking in relation to diversity around different learning abilities. So people who might have learning challenges to learning for various different reasons, or may have various different physical or mental capabilities, and trying to accommodate that in learning. And I suppose on a really practical basis, and I know we have people from around the world, there's a set of principles that you may or may not have come across. They are generally universally accepted these days, and there's huge amount of free resource available online around them called Universal Design for Learning Principles. And if you haven't come across them yet as an L&D professional, I would encourage you to Google it. And in Ireland, we have a great charity called Aware. Aware.ie is their website. And on there, they have a really good explanation of those principles. And there's 3 foundation principles as part of that in relation to engaging people in the learning process with various different levels of ability. And there's almost a checkbook or a checklist that you as a learning professional can follow, no matter what intervention you're developing, be it mentoring or a training program online or a follow yourself module, that will help with the practical elements and thinking about people who have various levels of ability in that, I suppose, diverse sense. And I suppose the second thing I'd say about embracing diversity and inclusion in your overall learning program is about access. So allowing people that have different, I suppose, from different backgrounds and from various different areas to participate in your learning. And one thing I see in organizations a bit is restrictive learning. So restricting different learning opportunities based on whatever it might be, job requirement or category of employee or whatever it is. And sometimes there's really good and reasonable reasons for that, but sometimes there aren't. And sometimes you see organizations restricting their parts of their learning program to particular categories of employee. And that's a danger, I suppose, to creating inclusion in the learning process, but an area that's open for debate, because there are articles out there saying you should absolutely do that as well. But from the perspective of creating an inclusive learning environment, removing barriers to learning is a hugely important part, and making as much of it as available as possible to employees, no matter who they are and what their circumstances are, so that they consume it when they can, is what it's about.
And we may not know what their circumstances are sometimes, isn't it, Ger, as well?
Exactly. And the way we've built things at the moment is for traditional types of learning. So we need to get more creative in terms of how we deliver it, be it if it's an article you read or a short video you watch or whatever it is, I suppose, to facilitate different people and their circumstances, especially right now.
Lovely, thank you for that. So
No
Luke,
worries.
I'm going to come to you now with a question or two, and I want to kind of pivot into culture a little bit more. So, you know, one challenge that I hear a lot about at the moment is how do we know if we have an effective L&D culture? And given your background, it'd be great to get your view on that. And also maybe some of the things that Sarah said at the start might come into that as well.
Absolutely. So I think ultimately, like if you were to look at like the high level analogy, ultimately that culture, you're hoping that employees are transparent about their needs to develop, and ultimately they have management that provide them the opportunities to grow in those areas. Now, what we do, like when we're trying to understand this, so I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this, but one of the fundamental pillars within employee engagement is career development. So whenever I'm trying to, with my team, trying to understand if our company's culture needs work in this area, or if there are employees that actually need development, ultimately it comes down to that career development pillar. Because what we find is, first of all, and what's really, really important, career development itself has a huge correlation with NPS. We're finding that employees in general, when they have a really, really strong learning and development culture, they're far more likely to recommend that place to their family and friends as a place to work. But also, once again, if we see those career development pillars at a low area, they're not likely to recommend it. But also, what we're finding is occupational stress goes up through the roof. So usually what we do is within the engagement piece itself, when we see it's low, normally we find is in a lot of companies it's down to career development, and that's where we start kind of working on that area.
Okay, thank you for that. I was on mute. Okay, so in terms then of data, let's talk about data for a second, Luke. So again, given your background, how do you think L&D departments can build data into their departments? That's kind of the first part of the question. And then obviously changing tomorrow's workplace, how should companies look at this data to help them better prepare for their workforce and their training in L&D? So let's talk about, yeah.
So a lot of people in data, they love talking about really complex setups and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to keep it really simple. So ultimately, when it comes to gathering data to understand, you know, what's going on, especially like within learning development, the easiest thing to do is actually to create surveys. That is the easiest way, because you're trying to understand, you're trying to get that live employee feedback of, like, you know, ultimately what their needs are, what their problems are, what they're struggling with, and ultimately where they want to grow. So that's the easiest way to do it. And, you know, there's a load of platforms out there, you know, that ultimately you can, you know, set up a premium and you can start to kind of engage and download that information quite quickly. Like that's something that we do at Talivest. Now, in terms of, you know, like trying to chain kind of, you know, tomorrow's, you know, piece in, ultimately kind of, I always talk about LinkedIn, right? So the LinkedIn's economic graph, one of the biggest things they have there is like tomorrow's desired set of skills. And what they do is they bring this down to the profile itself. And profiling is extremely important. We talked about profiles kind of, we didn't go into detail. It was kind of first talked with Wendy. So she talked about ultimately that kind of content piece and making it kind of, you know, specific to different individuals so they want to engage in content. That all comes down to profiling. And so if you were to look at the desired set of skills, being able to kind of LinkedIn releases. So for example, for accountants, senior accountants, for data engineers, for junior and senior, they actually release what sort of skills are most desirable for them to be successful in the future. And that's something that, you know, employees need to be aware of. It's something that companies need to be aware of. And it's something that ultimately when we're recording this data, and ultimately when we do a learning and development survey and we can actually see, and this is something that we do, we try to understand what are the areas that need to be improved for each individual employee. So for example, we'll be able to see that communication is low or management is high, etc. Ultimately, we'll be able to see within that role, okay, so for this junior level accountant, they actually over-index within the communication pillar, but when it comes to management, that's something that they need an area of improvement. And in that area, because of that desired set of skills, we can start to make recommendations on what actions they need to make to improve that pillar, but not only from what we see in the economic graph, but also, the power of correlation. So kind of one thing, and I was only speaking to kind of my manager about this, is that like we released a model recently, it's called the energy model. And so the idea behind this energy model is that there are certain actions that an employee can take that ultimately boost them, and there are actions they can take that kind of drop them down. So for example, something will take energy away is something the likes of work-life conflict. Something that would bring energy in is the likes of enablement. And so what we're seeing is that when employees are kind of given that opportunity to grow in the likes of communication, once again, that brings down the occupational stress. So kind of to summarize that, understanding the desired set of skills for individual profiles, then recording information to understand where your profiles, where your employees sit, that's where you're going to be able to see the white space of areas of improvement. And that's where you start to make your actions upon.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to do a bit of a free-for-all questions now. So what I'd ask the panel to do is maybe unmute yourself if you want to kind of contribute to some of these questions. So let's talk about that horrible term, Zoom fatigue. This is things that are happening very quickly. As a trainer, I certainly get it, but I know the participants certainly get it too. So this has been, obviously we use other things in Zoom, we use MS Teams, WebEx, things like that, but the term Zoom fatigue has been coined over the last couple of months. And Sarah, see you unmuting yourself straight away. So I know you're dying to say something on this one, but we'll include other people if you want to say something as well. What do you think of this, Sarah? Do you think it's a real thing? What can we do around it?
Yeah, 100% is a real thing. And this goes back to kind of my point around preparing and understanding what your learners need. And one of the things that became very apparent quite quickly is that you can't obviously do a direct like-for-like transfer of a classroom to a Zoom session. I've seen a lot of trainers do this, and this is a big no-no. You cannot have people sitting in front of a Zoom session for 6 hours. Even if you take your regular breaks as you would normally take in a classroom, it's just not possible. The maximum length of time you're probably going to get with somebody is maybe 90 minutes. And even within that 90 minutes, unless you keep it engaging, you're going to lose them. We've all heard the old adage that people's attention spans are decreasing. I think the latest results showed that it's about 6 seconds before you'll essentially lose them. So if you keep that in, I think it's 6 seconds now. Yeah, 6 seconds, unless you're doing something to keep them engaged, then you will lose their attention for 6 seconds.
That's like the goldfish in a bowl.
It's exactly like the goldfish, 100%. So if you take that into consideration, and you are now dealing with the fact that they have all of these wonderful distractions around them, including their Outlook popping up every now and again, instant messaging popping up every now and again. So setting the classroom up in a virtual setting is really important, and making sure, this is the key one, they have to have their camera on. And that is a big thing for a trainer. You have to tell them to have their camera on. If you see the eyes shifting down or shifting over here, you can tell immediately there is some distraction near them that is going to interrupt their attention. But 90 minutes is about the maximum. So chunking your content will alleviate a lot of that Zoom fatigue that people have, and also spreading out the session. So if you've got a full session that would normally take 6 hours, do one 90-minute session every couple of days or even once a week, and give them homework to do in between.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. Again, as a trainer, any of my half-day masterclasses, I'm condensing it into 90 minutes with a break, and then pre-work and post-work in terms of that. On the camera thing, it's interesting, Sarah, because you'll often get excuses from users saying, oh, I have very low Wi-Fi here, I better switch off my camera. Trust me, the dog ate my homework kind of thing. I've heard every single excuse possible now about not turning off the cameras. So I've heard it all. And I don't believe anyone, by the way, in terms of that. Luke, did you want to add on to that?
Yes, so we hear this all the time, especially with onboarding experience. And so ultimately, like, my advice would be, there are two kind of, fundamentally, I'm sure Jer might throw in something here. Fundamentally, there are two types of learners. There's the theoretical type and there's the practical type. And it's just understanding just that audience, because ultimately, if you have a practical audience, you need to engage with them. And that's the attention spans. They can jump quite quickly. If you're lucky enough to have a theoretical audience, that's where you can throw a lot more content at them and kind of expect them to kind of jump their way through it. So just a little bit of advice in that area.
Okay. Jared, did you want to input it on as well? Yeah.
Well, I'm laughing at the chunking. I think we've been too kind to Irish university students. We're doing 20 minutes maximum to try and keep attention with them. But anyway, yeah, and I suppose I was only adding to say in advance, I always think as well when it comes to pulling people on an online classroom, I ask myself 3 questions. Do people need to be there? Do I need to do this on an online classroom? If they do, how can I get their buy-in to counteract that fatigue? So back to what I was talking about earlier. And is there anything I can possibly do differently for this learning so it doesn't have to be the online classroom, is quite often what I think as well. So is there other ways I can get them to pace and take control of their own learning on this without having to listen to me talking?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very different way. And I think somebody mentioned earlier, I think maybe Sarah, I'm not sure if it was you, but you know, we can't just translate what we've been doing in the classroom online. It just does not work. It's not the same thing. Yes, the principles are the same, the message is the same, the core education or message behind what we're teaching is the same, but it's all about delivery now, and that's it, because our attention spans are just not there. So on this, and again, this is a free for all, so you can just unmute yourself if you want to contribute to this. Do you think, right, let's talk about after COVID, which I hope will be at some point in the near future, right? Let's hope. So after COVID, when things get back to whatever normal is going to be, do you think this is still going to be the way forward, or do you think a more blended approach is the best way? What do we think on that, if anyone would like to contribute? Sarah, up you go.
Sorry, I apologize. I just, it's just going to keep happening. So I suppose what I would bring to this conversation is maybe some private sector in-house knowledge. So I've been following the trends from a business perspective over the last 6 months, and see not from an L&D perspective, but actually just from a business perspective. What is the trend? What is the prediction after this? And give, especially within the tech sector, it is very, very clear that there is an unwillingness to bring people back to the office for a number of reasons. One is actually the cohort of employees that you either have or are trying to recruit within that sector, because it's really tough in Ireland at the moment to get the people. So tech sector employers, which we are now looking at, well, if we're not tied to having a physical location, that opens up huge possibilities from a recruitment perspective. So you're looking at that from just an employee base. Does it make sense to go back to a physical building? Obviously, there's huge repercussions across all parts of business in relation to that. But specifically for L&D, it's going to be very unlikely then that a classroom, a pure classroom-based strategy is going to make sense if you've got 90% of your employee base remote. So the approach that I've been taking, and this has been my messaging to internally in my own business, is that I have no intention of moving back to classroom, and it'll be pure blended. Yeah, pure blended.
Luke, did you want to add there?
Yeah, so since the start of COVID, we've been doing a thing called a new ways of working analysis. And it's ultimately trying to understand those employees' needs, you know, since everything has changed. And then ultimately asking the question about, like, you know, when COVID drops, you know, how do you feel about going back to normal? Well, what we've been finding is predominantly most of the customers we've been dealing with, the most popular response has been most of them want to stick to a 2 to 3 day at working from home.
Ooh, I think we've lost
approach. I think this learning development piece. Sorry?
We lost you there for a moment, Luke. It's no problem. We have you back. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So ultimately what we're seeing is predominantly the responses that we've been getting in that analysis is that most people want to spend 2 to 3 days working from home a week. So I do believe it's going to be very much a blended approach. And that's coming from a data perspective as well, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So I have another question here in terms of preparing just general employees for the future. I actually did my thesis 5 years ago, Sarah, speaking of your thesis, and my cobwebs got blown off mine as well, because I did it on the impact of the virtual worker at home, and I specialized in professional isolation. So it's very, very prevalent at the moment. We're all having to learn new skills as employees at the moment. Obviously, resilience, things like that is key. But again, this is a general question to whoever wants to take this. What do you think we need to prepare our employees in terms of skills to embrace these future challenges? Now, we're not just talking webinars and self-help and things like that, but what things do we need to start building into L&D because of the challenges at the moment? Andrew.
I think it's super context sensitive as well. Certainly when we look at data globally, it's super fascinating to see different countries might be sort of seeing a greater adoption of sort of technical skills training, sort of getting up to speed with how to do a pivot table in Microsoft Excel. Other locations, other industries might be more focused on mental health awareness. So I think in answer to that, it's just sort of disaggregating it to go, okay, for the different roles within the organization, for the different sort of locations that we operate, what's the right sort of material to sort of match there versus, I suppose, no human, no person is average. And so I think sort of going, okay, well, this is sort of one size fits all approach. As I think Wendy was sort of saying with that sort of personalization, I think that's a really important part of that sort of future sort of curation of content.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
It's something that's come up actually recently, and it's one of these. This would never even come in to my thought process if it wasn't for what's happening. Management, and obviously change the management skills, as we know, changes year on year as different things come about that they need to deal with in the difference of the employee cohort. But a very practical one that never even entered my head was things around performance management, and I've been working with our HR team to try and develop what this could look like. And what I mean by that is the very practical application of if somebody is in the middle of a performance issue, how does a manager have those meetings that are required legally if you're in the middle of a performance process, because legally you have to document that these meetings have happened. The meetings might need to take place with a trade union representative. The proof of the meetings need to be submitted possibly to the WRC. So the actual practical application of how that works when you aren't able to physically have those meetings is a very interesting topic, and it's something that I'm now working with to try and see, well, how do we develop those skills? Because it's a skill that a manager needs face to face, which is quite difficult for managers to have anyway. And now add the added complexity of having to do it when you can't even physically see the person. It's quite, because there's a legal ramification to it as well, which is still kind of starting to come out from the courts as to what this actually looks like. So it's quite an interesting one.
It's all new. I'm past the time, and we've time for one last question. Wendy, I'd love to get your opinion on this, if that's possible, if you're comfortable in asking that. So how can the learning function, or L&D, really impose its strategic relevance with budgets under increasing scrutiny in COVID? And anyone can answer this, of course, but Wendy, I'd love to hear, because you've worked in so many different organizations with such a diverse background, how can we still put ourselves on that map when budgets are, fighting, especially in the boardroom with partners in a company? How do we put that stamp down to say, no, L&D is very important and needs this?
Yeah, I would say it's following the model that HR as a whole has approached, of the HR business partner model, of looking beyond what are those basic transactions we provide and basic HR services, to say that as we look at what the ROI is on our services in a learning organization, we should be able to and be confident in the metrics we can share that shows that business impact. So it pains me today when I still see a lot of learning organizations' main metrics be around participation rates and even satisfaction rates, where I think, sure, it's important to know if participants enjoy the learning. Participation rates, I think, mean nothing, by the way, other than on a compliance side, because beyond that, all you've said, if it's not doing anything relevant for the learner, is that you might have wasted a lot of employees' time and taken up a lot of money training them. So I'm very keen on, from a learning perspective, making sure when we deploy learning, we're tying it back to key business measures, like literally from a sales perspective. We would be looking at, does percent quota attainment go up after people have taken that training? Are we seeing better rates of customer satisfaction when employees go through customer service training? So I think, again, you really have to position yourself as that strategic partner that's driving key business measures instead of those basic measures that learning people tend to get excited about.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. And I do also think, poor trainers are getting a bit of flack at the moment to those happiness sheets and evaluation forms, because they're trying their best to adapt to this platform, and you can't please everyone. And this is what's happening out there, is they're getting very downbeat over this, because people are saying, oh, the Zoom was an hour, it should have been 40 minutes. And you're getting lots of different feedback in terms of that. We're trying to get a 70% satisfaction rate with most courses, because we just can't please everybody. Would anyone else like to tag on to that final question?
Absolutely. So it's ultimately, like just what Wendy said, it's connecting those dots because traditionally learning analytics has been about participation rates, satisfaction rates, etc. So what we've been doing is we've been connecting the dots with engagement. And so we've been able to understand then ultimately, let's just say one particular profile does a course in management or communication. Ultimately, does that improve engagement? What area, what pillar does that improve? So you actually have a meaty ROI statistic to kind of come back and talk to your business about. We're able to make an impact on employee engagement by releasing this sort of kind of learning strategy. So absolutely.
Love it. Thank you. Any final comments from anyone on the panel? And when we were waiting to hear if there is, we were inundated with questions from people on the call today. So we weren't able to cover every single question just in the interest of time, but Tallyvest will be putting together a white paper following this session, and we'll deal with any of those extra questions we didn't get around to. But some of the questions did overlap, and we tried to batch them and include them where we could. But just want to check, is there anything else one of the panelists would like to say as a parting comment before we go? And I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes back before their lunchtime. I'm giving them that buffer time before they go on to that next call. Anything else anyone would like to add? No. Sarah, you sure? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been recorded and you will get a communication following this from Tallyvest. Thank you so much to each and every panelist for sharing your thoughts. We could probably go on for 3 or 4 more hours on this, but we're conscious that everyone, 6 seconds, you said, Sarah? We've way overplayed that. So thank you very much for your time and for joining us, and take care and be safe, everybody. Bye-bye.